So we initiated our series of lectures on cellular energy metabolism in order to be able to answer the question of how to help this woman and many other people you will meet over the time of your career who want to lose weight. And so this case involved really good initial data where anthropometric measurements were taken, both height and weight. BMI was taken, which is less valuable from a body composition standpoint, but good to use against normative data and health risk classification. But this, the evaluation went further and actually got percentage of fat, which is a much better way to assess body composition than simply looking at height and weight, because it really looks at what percentage of your body is made up of fat. And that's because as higher percentages of your body are fat, you become a greater and greater risk for that long list of things that can occur that are associated with obesity. Diabetes, cardiovascular disease, certain types of cancers. So the amount of fat in your body is more important than just how much you weigh. These measurements provide a great starting point to set realistic and appropriate weight loss goals. And if you remember in Unit 2, we discussed how to use body fat percentage to set a weight loss goal, where your goal is to maintain lean body mass while you decrease percent fat. So let's talk about how we prescribe exercise when really the goal is weight loss. So anyone who is seeking medical attention for overweight or obesity should be part of a comprehensive program. There needs to be some degree of reduction in caloric intake. It is best if that can be prescribed and it can be moderately reduced, and it is not recommended to go onto these starvation diets. Increasing physical activity, and then really working on behavioral change strategies so that this is a long-term change. Obviously, we are in the physical activity game, so that is the piece that we will be talking about today. So these are recommendations for physical activity based on goals. And this is an important one to just sit with and look at for a minute. The top line says the amount of minutes per week if your goal is to maintain or improve your health. And that's where the 150 minutes per week of moderate intensity exercise comes from. That number is associated with maintaining and improving health outcomes. If you want to prevent weight gain, not even lose weight, but just prevent weight gain, you need to have somewhere between 150 to 250 minutes a week of physical activity. If your goal is to have clinically significant weight loss, 225 to 420 minutes per week of physical activity. This is the one place where I really feel like a disservice has been made with, relatively speaking, how well people are familiar with this 150 minutes per week. I think it was a great campaign for physical activity. It really got awareness out. But for many, many people, this described a ceiling instead of a floor. I have to at least get my 150 minutes in per week to be good. But truly, that's supposed to be the minimum. You're supposed to get at least 150 minutes per week and then go on above that, especially if your goal is weight loss. Once you have accomplished your weight loss goals and you want to prevent any weight gain once you're done with this active part of your program, 200 to 300 minutes per week to prevent weight gain after weight loss. These are important numbers to kind of sit in and think about and be ready to talk our patients into if this is an area that you're going to be really dealing with as part of a team that's approaching weight loss goals for patients. So let's get into how activity can make an impact, not just on total minutes per week, but what are we talking about? The type of exercise matters. So there's a lot of buzz and excitement around how many steps you take per day, so pedometer-based step goal. The research shows that your weight loss range could be somewhere maybe between 0 to 1 kilogram. Clinically significant weight loss, very unlikely with a step-based goal. There are a lot of, we will get to this in the final lecture of the semester, there is a lot of health advantages to being more active during the day, not with exercise, but just physically moving, getting up and moving. So I'm not saying that maintenance of your steps per day is a bad thing, but this would be an ineffective strategy if this is the only type of physical activity you are adding and you're hoping to lose weight. Aerobic exercise training only gets around 0 to 2 kilograms of weight loss, and it is possible, but only with really, really high volumes. So just adding aerobic training alone, nothing else. Resistance training alone is unlikely to make any clinically significant weight loss goals. It offers other benefits, as some of which we've talked about, and we'll talk a little bit more as we go. If you combine aerobic and resistance training, it looks a lot like aerobic. It's possible, but only if the aerobic exercise had a pretty high volume. When you combine calorie restriction with aerobic exercise training, that's where you really start to see clinically significant weight loss goals. So this is an important thing to communicate with patients, that the best way to accomplish their goals is to do some combination of both. To discuss weight loss, we have to first appreciate what we're talking about and then maybe dispel some common myths around exercise and weight loss. This pie chart is showing total energy usage over a day. And in a given day, around 70% of our energy that we burn in our body comes from our basal metabolic rate, or sometimes referred to as your resting metabolic rate, which is how it's written in your notes. The only difference between resting metabolic rate and basal metabolic rate is the degree of complete peace that you take that measurement in. There is a lot of rules around basal metabolic rate, you have a bunch of criteria met when you take the measurement to have it be basal metabolic rate. So a lot of times in a lot of research, they record resting metabolic rate, which is metabolic rate when you're largely calm and at rest and not doing anything else. But basal metabolic rate has a higher threshold of stillness. I'll just put it that way. All right, but so 70% of our resting metabolic rate, 70% of our total energy expenditure is used to fuel just our basic activity that goes on below the surface that you don't even see. So resting metabolic rate is our heart pumping, our lungs breathing, the peristalsis of our intestines squeezing in and out, the transporters moving ions across our membrane, all that use of ATP just to keep our cells alive is 70% of all of the energy we burn in the day. We do about 10% on digestion and thermogenesis, and then somewhere between 15 and 30%, depending on the physical activity nature that is chosen, is physical activity. So because of this huge piece of the pie that just comes from your resting metabolism, there's a lot of look at like how you could manipulate resting metabolic rate to facilitate weight loss goals. And we talked about in the second unit, we used this slide before where we showed this study that looked at 6 obese individuals who were put onto a starvation diet and looked at their weight loss. And what they found in this study was that with just caloric restriction alone, the actual weight loss was not as significant as what was expected if you just did the math on what was kind of going in and what was going out. because as soon as the body was eating less and taking in less calories, there was this significant reduction in resting metabolic rate. Resting metabolic rate. So they decreased their resting metabolism in response to the starvation diet, which really took away from any weight loss potential from the caloric restriction alone. Let's just do the math on this one. So if our total energy expended per day, let's give it 2,700 kilocalories, is the energy expended completely per day. That's resting metabolic rate, thermogenesis, digestion of food, and physical activity. Somewhere between 60 to 75% of that is going to just be going to our resting metabolic rate. So let's go on the lowest end of that and talk about the person who says they have a low resting metabolism. Let's say it's 60% of 2,700 kilocalories. How much of that total energy was fueling just the underlying processes that keep our cells alive? About 1,620 kilocalories were going towards resting metabolic rate. So what if we could increase resting metabolic rate? And let's set a really tiny goal here, because this isn't an easy thing necessarily to manipulate, although it's a point of a lot of focus and research. What if we could increase resting metabolic rate by just 1%? So instead of 60% of 2,700 kilocalories, it is 61% of the same total energy expenditure per day. Would be the difference, would get you to 1,647 kilocalories, or about 27 kilocal difference per day, which doesn't sound like a whole lot, 27 kilocal difference per day. But if you are able to burn that much more per day, every day, just in the background, that would closely equivalent to about 1 kilogram of extra stored macronutrient. Let's be optimistic and say we're losing fat. That's 1 kilogram of fat loss per year. Now that becomes significant. So 1 kilogram is about 2.2 pounds. Whoa, this is tempting. This is resting stuff. This is what goes on in the background. And we could be plowing through 2.2 pounds of fat per year without doing anything else. This would be so cool. So can we do this? Can we increase resting metabolic rate? The short answer to that question is we don't know for sure. We know from these early studies that when you decrease caloric intake, you can reduce resting metabolic rate and actually burn fewer kilocalories in the background as your body goes into starvation mode. We also know that resting metabolic rate is closely related to the amount of fat-free mass. So the more lean tissue that you have. So while there aren't great studies that show an intervention raising metabolic rate, there are studies that show that highly trained athletes have higher resting metabolic rates than age-matched controls. And if you were designing an exercise program, because of the relationship between resting metabolic rate and the amount of lean tissue, any program that maintains or increases your fat-free mass or your lean tissue has the best bet at increasing metabolic rate. So there's a lot of theories that if you build more muscle, then you should be able to increase metabolic rate for that exact reason. The studies aren't great to confirm that. But they do show that when you add resistance training into a caloric restriction diet, you have a better maintenance of your lean body mass. So resting metabolic rate is closely associated with your fat-free mass. And if you add resistance training to a caloric restriction diet, you will have the best chance of maintaining lean body mass. So if caloric restriction diets have the potential to lower your resting metabolic rate, the research would support that adding resistance training can offset this effect. And whether it is related to the caloric intake of building more muscle and the process by which that takes, or if it is related to some other factor, we don't exactly know the mechanism, but it has been shown to maintain lean body mass. In a 2018 systematic review, they concluded that adding resistance training to a caloric restricted diet prevented about 93% of the lean body mass loss that was observed in the control groups that didn't have resistance training. So, can you strength train to lose weight? The evidence says no. Can you add strength training to increase your resting metabolic rate? There's no data at this time that would support that sentence. Will adding resistance training help maintain lean body mass when you're doing a caloric restriction diet? Yes, it will. So keep that in mind and know that the data is probably still coming out on this. There might be better strategies of how to really target resting metabolic rate because of what a significant impact this can have if you can raise resting metabolic rate. The next common exercise theory that you will read on blogs is that you can do spot reduction. And one of my more shocking moments, I think I was making fun of this exact thing, the ab electrode squeezer dude. And I was saying something about exercise to lose your belly weight. And my sister-in-law, who's an MD, was like, oh, what's the exercise? I want to do it. And I'm like, what? But there's no one exercise you can do to remove fat in one area. All right, let's talk about this spot reduction thing. So the theory is that if you would like to lose fat mass in your stomach, you would do sit-ups, or you would do some kind of strength training right underneath that fat, and that will eat up all that fat for the fueling of the muscle, I guess is the theory, and that fat will leave right there. So a great study looked at a 27-day sit-up training, and they measured any changes in the subcutaneous abdominal fat. And they compared it to changes that would have happened in the subscapular region and the gluteal region. Okay, so they did 3 different areas where they measured subcutaneous fat: the abs, the butt, and the subscap region. And they did it before and after an abdominal training workout, 27 days of abdominal training. And what they found was there was no difference in the fat change between these 3 areas. So you didn't specifically lose fat in the abdominal area because you contracted abdominal muscles just below that fat. And why is that the case? Because that's not how our body doesn't eat the fat right next to the muscle, right? Lipolysis is a systemic effect. The breakdown of fat is stimulated by hormones like epinephrine and glucagon and growth hormone and cortisol. These hormones are systemic, right? Hormones go everywhere in the blood. So you don't get to just turn on fat breakdown in one particular area. You can turn it on everywhere. Now, there have been studies that have shown changes in girth in a particular area that was exercised. And they have taken these girth measurements and extrapolated a theory that you lost fat because the girth went down. But when you actually followed up and did a more detailed look at what happened, the changes in girth are because of changes in muscle tone, not because of losses in fat. This is another really cool study that was done where they looked at tennis players and they compared the amount of fat in their dominant arm versus their non-dominant arm. Now, a tennis player, their dominant arm is going to get a lot more exercise than their non-dominant arm. And when they compared the two arms, there was a significant difference, and their dominant arm had a larger girth. But when they did skin fold assessment, the amount of fat in each arm was the same. So the difference in size was because of skeletal muscle hypertrophy, not specific fat loss at the site where the muscle was contracting. So can we use exercise for spot reduction? No. I mean, that one spot you care about will eventually go down if you lower your total body's fat mass. But we can't stick electrodes on our gut and eat the fat beneath it. And we can't exercise one part of our body and just take the fat out of that one part of our body. Lipolysis is a systemic effect. If you want to break down fat, you want to stimulate breakdown fat globally. And then pray it comes off the spot you really hate looking at. All right, the next one that often gets brought up already at this point in the semester, I think, if we were in person, was really exploiting this relationship of exercise intensity if your goal is burning fat. And this graph that I showed earlier about how at lower intensity exercise we predominantly burn fat looks like, well, sweet. I'll just exercise at 20% of my maximum capacity, smooth and easy, burn tons of fat, lose all the fat in my body that I want. It sounds like a great idea. Everybody loves exercising at less intensities. That's easy breezy. That's going for a walk. It's not so simple when you look more carefully at the numbers. So this chart is included in your notes. This is data from a 23-year-old female. She has a VO2 max of 45 milliliters per kilogram per minute. And she is going to exercise for 30 minutes. And they did these recordings at two different intensities. The first one was at 50% of her VO2 max. And her average VO2 at this low intensity was 1.5 liters per minute. Her RER, respiratory exchange ratio, was 0.85. So if it was all fat, it would be 0.7. If it was all carbs, it would be 1. So our resting RER is typically around 0.8. So she's still doing some combination of fat and carbs. When you actually look at the percent of kilocalories by fat and carb, it's about 50-50 at this exercise intensity. The kilocalories that she burned from carbs after 30 minutes was 110, and at fat was 110. So her total kilocalories that she burned in this activity was 220. They did the same mode, but increased the intensity to 75% of her VO2 max. So we've increased exercise intensity, which you can see corresponds to a higher average VO2. Her RER is getting closer to 1, showing that she is using a greater percentage of carbohydrates to fuel this activity, which plays out here. You can see that the percent burned is much higher of carbs. Look at this, only 33% of fat. This is looking like this might actually work. Kilocalories from carbs, whoa, it's gone way up, 222. Kilocalories from fat have not changed because the total kilocalories burned for the activity has gone up. So even though the percentage of total kilocalories burned during the activity went down at the lower intensity, you burn more kilocalories at a higher intensity. So there's actually no difference in fat between the two. So you have to be very cautious when thinking about exploiting intensity to manipulate which macronutrient you are burning. If this girl's goal of exercising was weight loss, you can see she expended almost 50% more total calories when she exercised at 75% of her max intensity at the same amount of time. So if she's fit enough to keep up this intensity for her exercise, she would be getting a lot more out of this exercise program because she's just burning more kilocalories. So you do burn the most fat, somewhere between 55 and 72% of your VO2 max, but it doesn't always necessarily correlate with more calories. So you want to really think about your overall weight loss goals. And remember that this chart was showing contribution to total energy as a percent of the energy being burned. So it is not an absolute number. This isn't in kilocalories. So even though there's a greater total percentage of fat at that exercise intensity, it's based on the total kilocalories being burned. So our gal who came in and wanted to lose weight saw a dietitian who prescribed a reduction of 500 to 1,000 kilocalories per day, and the physical therapist that was on the team prescribed physical activity. So here's the plan that was given. The physical therapist took resting vitals with a standard BP cuff and got baseline data. She put the patient on a standard cycle ergometer until the patient rated their intensity of 14 to 16 on the Borg RPE scale. The patient was instructed to stay on the bike for as long as they could tolerate the activity, and then the patient was prescribed a maximum time achieved to be performed daily the maximum time that she was able to be doing that activity at that initial visit was prescribed and told to be performed daily for a long-term goal of losing 50 pounds in 6 months. So what do you feel about her activity plan? This is what I think about this activity plan. A massive fail. I would encourage you, if you are feeling up to it, to pause the video and see if you could come up with each of these steps. What did they do wrong when prescribing physical activity for a weight loss goal? We'll go through each of them together and think about what we can change to be able to prescribe exercise to be more successful. The first thing that is missing is that there's no mention of any kind of pre-participation screen or risk assessment. I would have gone through the ACSM's pre-participation screen. Typically, there is no exercise test needed for low to moderate intensity exercise, but I still would have taken the time to do it. They took resting vitals with a standard BP cuff to get baseline data. All right, so taking blood pressure, very good. Thumbs up on taking resting vitals. Why is it extra? It's always good to take vitals. Why is it extra important to take vitals on this patient? Obesity is very likely to come with comorbidities. If you prescribe exercise and they have an abnormal response to exercise, the only way to know if it's abnormal is to know what their vitals were at baseline. So resting vitals is good. It is the use of a standard size blood pressure cuff, which is problematic when taking blood pressure on a patient with obesity. So this would have been a great first step if they had used a bariatric size. It is extremely important to make sure the size of the blood pressure cuff is used on the proper size of the blood pressure cuff is used on the upper arm when taking the measurement. There's a lot of research on what happens when you are not appropriately sized correctly when taking a blood pressure. In fact, most blood pressure measurement errors occur because the practitioner does not take the time to determine if the patient's arm circumference falls within the range indicators on the cuff. Studies have shown that using too small of a blood pressure cuff can cause a patient's systolic blood pressure measurement to increase from somewhere between 10 to 40 millimeters of mercury. So totally inaccurate measurements can be taken. And that range indicator is right on the cuff. So there's no additional measurements that have to be taken, but when you're putting that cuff on, make sure that you are falling within the appropriate range. Next step was they chose to put the patient on a standard cycloergometer. The cycloergometer is a very good choice for this patient. Arm and leg ergometers are very commonly used for aerobic exercise in the bariatric population because they typically have a lot of musculoskeletal and orthopedic issues. So this can be a very safe way, lower impact way to have aerobic exercise. The cycloergometer would need to be bariatric grade. So you definitely want to know the weight limitations of any piece of exercise equipment you're putting your patient on. And while cycloergometry might end up being the best option for this patient, the most important thing when choosing the mode of exercise is to find an exercise that they like and that they have access to equipment that they would actually keep going with it. So to just put someone on a bike because it's in your clinic and it's handy and you might think it's safer, if they hate biking, this would be a poor choice, even if it has a lot of good things about it. The intensity, so they had the patient get on the cycloergometer and just go until your intensity was 14 to 16 on the Borg RPE scale. It would be more appropriate to start an exercise program at a moderate intensity. And then you could always progress to more vigorous. So moderate intensity physical activity usually falls somewhere around 11 to 14 on the Borg scale. Vigorous intensity physical activity is around 17 to 19. So this is on the higher end when you're just beginning and starting out. Using moderate intensity exercise gives you the health benefits. You might need to work at a slightly longer duration for increasing fat breakdown, which would be more likely to get those longer durations at slightly lower intensities. So there might be a reason that you would even stay at a lower intensity depending on your individual weight loss goals. The next piece of this, the patient was instructed to stay on the bike for as long as they could tolerate the activity. This is describing a maximum performance. There's no way that they are going to be able to do that every day. There might be a time when you might have someone do an activity for as long as they can tolerate to assess kind of a non-systematic assessment of their functional capacity, and then use that for goal setting or to prescribe exercise below that time. But if you tell someone to do a max performance daily, you're setting them up to be unsuccessful in your exercise program. It would be unlikely that they would be able to achieve the minutes necessary to accumulate over time to lose weight if you are doing everything, pushing them to their max. You want to combine your exercise and weight loss goals and kind of your fit prescription with compliance and kind of doability. Research shows you will get increased compliance with an exercise program with this patient population if you do shorter bouts of exercise, like you start with less than 10 minutes of exercise, and then progressively add time, like add 5 minutes every 1 to 2 weeks. And while this might go against kind of your grain of kind of the ACSM fit recommendations, what the studies have found is that when you do short bouts, but you increase the frequency that you do exercise, patients clock an increased total minutes per week. So if you try to get these longer duration exercise bouts, they will do fewer total minutes over the entire week. But if you allow short bouts of activity, have them do it more frequently, they'll get total minutes per week, and increase total minutes per week, and they will increase their weight loss when looked at comparison studies over a 20-week exercise program. So short bouts of exercise can work as long as you're keeping in mind the accumulation of total minutes. And if they're doing a shorter duration of exercise, they will need to do exercise more frequently. The last piece was the patient was prescribed the maximum time achieved in that first performance, which we've already discussed, but they were told to perform that daily with the long-term goal of losing 50 pounds in 6 months. What's really missing here is the progress over time. There's no education on weekly goals. There's no like minute goal, like let's how many minutes we can get this week. You need short-term goals that patients feel like they're accomplishing something and moving toward a long-term goal. A long-term weight loss goal over 6 months is great, but we need to give them little successes along the way. So walking time is a really great way to show progress over time. If you give them something achievable early on, they're more likely to buy into the exercise program, feel good about the commitment they're making to their health because they see progress over time. You were rating a 10-minute walk at an RP, you were rating it on the ratings exertion scale at 13 to 14 and you couldn't even get 10 minutes. Now that same walk is a 12 and you're doing it for 15 minutes, you're less breathless. You can set these little goals over time. So weekly goals, education on the benefit of achieving these small goals along the way, and then having some plan to progress the activity. To say to someone on day one, you did the cycle ergometer, let's say their maximum time was 20 minutes at an RPE of 14, do that for 6 months, completely takes away the idea of progressive overload over time, to continue to make the physical activity slightly more challenging so the body continues to adapt. The last thing I take issue with on this list is this is sort of arbitrary 50 pounds. Like, where did that come from? Perhaps there was a systematic approach to getting there, but you'd want to really talk that through with the patient and make sure they understand where that number came from. When considering appropriate amounts of weight to lose over time, minimal reduction in body weight over 3 to 6 months should be at least 3 to 10% of your body weight. If weight loss goes beyond about 5 to 10% of your body weight, that would truly require very aggressive nutritional changes and exercise and behavior modification. So that's a very overly aggressive weight loss goal. So let's look at her weight. She was 275 pounds. If we want to set a more realistic goal of 3 to 10% of her body weight, that would be weight loss of somewhere between 8.25 to 27.5 pounds in like a 3 to 6 month window. So that 50 pounds is super aggressive, and depending on the team and the approach, that might be beyond the kind of capacity of the weight loss plan. So kind of keeping in mind, based on their body weight, kind of what's realistic, but then would be even better to make a weight loss goal based on their percent body fat and making it a very specific goal to their body composition. So what can we change to make this more successful? Here is the fit recommendation for individuals with overweight or obesity. Aerobic exercise at least 5 days a week, if not more. Starting your intensity moderate and then progressing to vigorous over time. If they can tolerate vigorous activity, there is a greater amount of health benefits that can be achieved through the exercise plan. If they can't tolerate it, or that's going to lower their compliance, it would be better to stick with an intensity that they would actually do. So 30 minutes a day. So you're kind of starting at that basement. The goal would be to get to 250 to 300 minutes per week. Prolonged rhythmic activities, the larger the muscle groups, the more metabolism that's happening, the better the use of stored macronutrients. Including resistance exercise 2 to 3 days a week, 60 to 70% of your 1 rep max, gradually increasing as they get stronger. Kind of their time is pretty consistent, and their mode is up to them, kind of accessibility and what they like to do. Flexibility is good, kind of in the same range that we see for the individuals who are not overweight or obese. So when this very smart lady was given this poor exercise plan, she very politely requested a new physical therapist. And this new physical therapist had excellent exercise physiology training and prescribed a walking program at an RPE of 12 to 13 for 30 minutes a day. They started the program at 5 to 10 minutes at a time and discussed with the patient that they might need to start at a lower RPE if necessary, and they kept a walking journal. How many minutes? What was your RPE? Any negative signs or symptoms or subjective reporting related to the walk. They joined she prescribed a water aerobics class at a local YMCA 2 days a week, which is an excellent way to prescribe exercise in community settings where you have a place that you have to show up at a certain time. There's a reportability there. There's a community of people who are working together. After 3 months, she was walking daily 45 minutes at an RPE of 14 to 16. She was continuing with her water aerobic class biweekly. She is reporting an increased energy and overall quality of life and increased ease in caring for her children. And at 3 months, she had lost 12 pounds. Very successful use of integrating exercise into this patient's life in a much more doable way. All right, thank you guys so much for your attention, and I'll see you next time.